At 21, by the world's unfeeling accounting, she had no home. Her uncle, Silas Blackwood, a man who calculated everything in numbers, had labeled her a liability, and so she was cast off. There was no remaining family to seek help from, no direction, and only $10 in an old leather handbag. She would soon spend 4 of those dollars to purchase a sealed, deserted train carriage. The car rested on a forgotten branch track in the high plains of Wyoming. Buying it was an act born of silent hopelessness, a desperate attempt to possess just one thing, no matter how small. Yet hidden from everyone, and beyond her wildest imagining, that rusted iron car contained a 3-decade-old secret and a payroll. Within it also lay a leather-bound ledger exposing the truth about the man who had turned her away. That truth was destined not only to transform her life, but to revive a town that had been given up for lost. Make yourself comfortable, and we'll share the tale of Nell Ashby. If you're tuning in from somewhere that feels overlooked, drop a comment down below. Nell wasn't educated in a classroom. Her schooling took place in the noisy shadows of her father's blacksmith shop. Johnny Ashby worked the railroad as a blacksmith, speaking in the hues of heated iron and the rhythmic beat of hammer striking anvil. His wholehearted loves were just 2, his daughter and the graceful mechanics of his craft. As soon as she could stand by the forge without wincing, he began teaching her. He didn't recite tool names as a list to be memorized. Instead, he taught them as a series of purposes. The ball-peen hammer was used for riveting, while the cross-peen for drawing out metal. The straight peen was meant for stretching. He showed her how to gauge a metal's temper by its colors: straw yellow, peacock blue, dove gray. "Everything has a grain, Nell," he'd say, his voice a deep murmur over the hissing quench tank. Wood, steel, even people, learn to work with them rather than against them, and they'll yield to you. Push against them, and they'll shatter or they'll shatter you. She grew familiar with the weight and feel of his favorite tool, a compact 2-pound cross-peen hammer with a hickory handle, its surface worn dark and smooth from the sweat and oils of his grasp. The hammer seemed part of him. In her small hands, it felt like holding onto his power. At 17, she lost her father quickly to a lung disease the doctor called consumption, and the forge fell quiet and cold. Her father's estranged elder brother, Uncle Silas Blackwood, came from his well-off town of Blackwood Station to take care of the funeral arrangements. Silas was everything his brother wasn't. John was shaped from iron and soot. Silas was built from paper and ink. As a banker and founder, he had built his town on land obtained through sharp, humorless deals. In his view, his brother's forge wasn't a place of skill but a poorly yielding asset. He sold the forge, the house, and the tools for an amount Nell found shockingly low. Then he took her in not out of kindness, but with the attitude of someone accepting an obligatory, if burdensome, burden. She stayed in his spacious home for 4 years. It was a silent house, like a phantom drifting through the corridors of his success. Her duties included household tasks. She had a tiny room and a place at the dining table, where talk always revolved around account books, interest rates, and shipping charges. Silas never mentioned her father, and when Nell once brought him up, her uncle merely fixed her with his chilly gray stare. "Your father never grasped the world as it truly is, Nell. He placed worth in emotions," he said. "In a balance sheet, there's no line item for such things." Throughout those 4 years, all she still had of her father was the little cross-peen hammer, wrapped safely in oilcloth. She kept it concealed at the very bottom of her chest. The sole remnant of Silas that had escaped his attention. Something worth no money, its only value being sentimental. Her departure from Blackwood Station arrived just as silently as her arrival there had been. Upon the morning she turned 21, her uncle offered no birthday wishes. Rather, he called her into his office, a space filled with the scent of aged paper and leather tomes, where he was seated at his large oak desk. A stack of documents lay perfectly aligned on his desk, and he didn't invite her to take a seat. "Nell," he started, in a monotonous, bureaucratic tone, "you are now of legal adult age. Accordingly, the subject of your maintenance requires resolution." Across the shiny wooden surface, he pushed a lone paper, an itemized bill. He had totted up the expenses for her meals, board, and garments over 4 years, accurate to the last cent. The amount was astronomical, exceeding any money she had ever encountered or dreamed of. "This is the expenditure your upkeep brought to my household." She gazed at the figure, the breath escaping her chest, an obligation impossible to settle, a prison constructed from paper. But, folding his hands together, he went on. "I am not someone without reason," he said. "I am willing to completely forgive what you owe. In return, you'll take a rail pass to any place west of this point, plus $10 to help you relocate." He slid the ticket and 2 $5 notes over, beside the bill. This wasn't a proposal but a sentence. There was no opportunity to dispute, none for any appeal. She had existed merely as a row in his financial records, and he was finalizing that entry. Gazing at his face, as featureless and inscrutable as a polished rock, she detected no hint of kinship, no recollection of his sibling. In her eyes, he was merely a man keeping his accounts orderly. "I understand," she replied, her tone unwavering. She took the ticket and the cash, but left the invoice untouched. It remained on the desk, a symbol of his distinct form of harshness. Back in her room, she filled her modest chest with her handful of gowns, her mother's pendant, and, buried at the very base, inside its protective oilcloth, her father's hammer. 60 minutes afterward, she stood on the platform of the Blackwood train station, with the approaching westbound locomotive's horn blaring. She didn't glance backward at the town that carried her uncle's surname. She just collected her belongings and headed into her new existence, one that opened with an obligation that wasn't hers and a $10 bill she'd done nothing to merit. Traveling taught her about being reduced. The locomotive departed Blackwood Station, a town of painted wood siding, orderly roads, and an unmistakable buzz of business. Everything served as a tribute to Silas Blackwood's drive. Nell rested on the rigid wooden seat in the carriage, her chest beside her, observing her familiar surroundings slip away. During the initial hour, the terrain reflected careful success. Enclosed grazing fields, well-fed cattle herds, and tidy homesteads with smoke spiraling from their chimneys. Yet as the engine continued west, the scenery shifted. Verdant tones faded to light yellow-brown, and the gentle slopes leveled out into one expansive, elevated plateau. The number of trees diminished, and those remaining hugged parched streams like tenacious afterthoughts. Breeze streaming through the open window no longer smelled pleasant with hay and damp soil. Instead, it was of a thin, arid quality, carrying hints of sage and dust. The wheel's steady clickety-clack over the tracks became an ever-present, mesmerizing rhythm. It tracked her transition from a place of chilly security into complete unpredictability. Her movement wasn't merely geographic, it carried her across different layers of fate. At every station, the number of riders dropped as they departed for minor farms or arid ranching communities, eventually leaving the carriage mostly vacant. The second day, the train seemed like a tiny, noisy entity traveling across an immeasurable, quiet void. Above stretched a vast, faded blue sky that felt like it settled heavily on the earth. Far away, rugged violet peaks sliced across the horizon, a goal that appeared hopelessly distant. Though her ticket read Rawlins, Nell found herself listening to a chat between the conductor and a brakeman. They mentioned a spur line known as Caldera Spur, where the rail company was putting unused rolling stock and machinery up for auction, selling it off as scrap metal. The conductor had shrugged and remarked, "That spur has been defunct for 2 decades. Trading it as scrap is more economical than transporting it away." In Nell's thoughts, a delicate, tentative notion started to emerge, possessing something even if merely discarded metal. The locomotive decelerated at a bare crossroads to take on water a nameless spot featuring just a water tank and a tiny telegraph building. Nell resolved her choice then and went to locate the conductor. She requested, "I'd like to alight at Caldera Spur." He glanced at her, taking in her plain gown and modest luggage, his face showing both sympathy and skepticism. "There's nothing at that stop, miss." "I know." "There's nothing at all," Nell replied. "Someone is expecting me." The fabrication sufficed. With a shrug, he tugged the signal cord. The train shuddered to a standstill next to a brief siding overrun with weeds. A faded signpost with flaking paint bore the name Caldera Spur. No station or platform existed, only a pair of lengthy, corroded rails diverging from the main track and vanishing into the sagebrush. The brakeman deposited her trunk onto the arid soil. With a hiss and a creak, the train began to depart. She stood completely isolated in the profound quiet of the elevated prairie. The breeze ruffled her hair while the sun blazed overhead. Caldera Spur wasn't a deserted settlement. It was the remnant of a community's aspirations. Only a dozen weathered edifices lingered, clustered closely as though seeking warmth from the relentless gusts. Among the ruins stood a bankrupt shop with shuttered windows, a stable whose roof had crumpled into exposed beams, and several modest saltbox homes gradually yielding to nature's onslaught. The track extended beyond those structures to a level, arid open space serving as the auction site. Roughly 20 men ranchers and junk dealers, their skin leathered and eyes fatigued, gathered around an exhausted-looking auctioneer in a sweat-stained hat. He pointed toward a heap of corroded rails and fractured ties. That lot went to the blue-shirted man for $3.50. His announcement faint in the breeze. Clutching her trunk in one hand, Nell approached the assembly, acutely aware of every eye fixed on her. In this setting of men and ruin, she stood out as a striking irregularity. Paying them no heed, she focused on the merchandise. Flat cars piled with decaying timber awaited, alongside a tender car denuded of its brass components. At the extreme far end rested a solitary, massive boxcar. This vehicle was a B40, class baggage carriage, constructed from dense oak and shielded by substantial iron sheets. Its coating flaked away, transforming the former vibrant crimson of the Wyoming and Pacific Railroad into a patchy reddish-brown stain. In contrast to its counterparts, it remained entirely shut. The massive sliding entrance wasn't merely secured. It had been sealed with a thick, unsightly weld seam running along the joint between the door and its casing. It loomed like an enormous, impenetrable safe. Adjacent to the door, a crisp, yellowed paper was fastened to the timber. That paper proved to be the lot listing. Lot 73, she recited. 1, Class B 40 boxcar. Contents unspecified. Sold in its present condition and location. Purchaser must handle transportation. Meanwhile, the auctioneer proceeded along the row, his sales pitch turning increasingly urgent as he attempted to unload the railroad's abandoned remnants. Upon reaching the boxcar, he gave it only a cursory look. Okay, everyone, Lot 73 is a sealed baggage car. Its contents are a mystery, likely 3 decades of grime and arachnids. It's not openable, and we won't make an attempt. Bidding begins at $5 for the metal. The men exchanged glances in mute agreement, shaking their heads. The expense of breaking into the car and towing it would surpass any scrap value. $5, gentlemen. $4 for the iron. The auctioneer scanned the modest audience, his eyes settling on Nell as he prepared to proceed. Instead, she lifted her hand in a timid yet deliberate motion. I offer $4, she declared, her tone resolute. Some of the men snickered, and the auctioneer's brows lifted in surprise. $4 from the young woman. Can I get 4 1/4? $4 going once, twice sold for $4 to the lady in the gray dress. He tapped a railway tie with his gavel, a crooked smile appearing. Well done, miss. She'll be yours once you determine how to relocate her. He chuckled, and the crowd followed suit. Disregarding their laughter, Nell strode to the auctioneer's stand. Opening her coin purse, she extracted 4 of her remaining $10. She accepted the plain handwritten receipt confirming the transaction. As the owner of an unopenable iron container in a non-existent settlement, she possessed only $6. Returning to the car, she placed her palm on the sun-heated, corroded surface, experiencing an initial rush of exhilarating fear. Surviving until she could tackle the car was her foremost concern, rather than the opening itself. As the sun sank behind the peaks and the wind turned biting, Nell realized that spending the night exposed was impossible. She wandered through the abandoned settlement, her footfalls resounding in the quiet. One structure stood in better condition than the rest, a modest lodging house bearing a sign that proclaimed the Caldera Rest. While the majority of its windows were shattered, a rear room remained sealed against the elements, with intact glass. Within, she discovered a basic iron bedstead, a wobbly table, and a compact wood-burning stove whose pipe, though rusted, was complete. The house became her refuge, and behind it she found a second boon, a well with a working hand pump. The water drawn from it was cold and pleasant, carrying hints of iron and rich soil. Now that she had water and a place to stay, she turned her attention back to the boxcar, pacing its length to examine the challenge. A heavy, rough weld and iron seam put in 3 decades earlier held the door shut. Whoever had made that seam clearly meant for it to last forever. Underneath, she spotted the tops of thick rivets. Prying it open demanded tools she lacked: a large sledge, a cold chisel, and plenty of time. Her father's hammer excelled at shaping metal, but it wasn't a tool for smashing things apart. The following day, she searched through the ruins of the livery stable. Buried beneath rotten straw were a pair of rusty yet usable tongs and a split anvil. At the old general store, she discovered a dusty barrel of coal that still could burn. She was assembling the pieces to build a forge. That night, a stranger came toward her humble campsite. He was elderly, his spine curved from years of toil, and his hands resembled twisted tree roots. His name was Jedidiah, a former Gandhi dancer who had helped lay the original tracks. These days he lived by himself in one of the few livable shacks around, getting by on a modest railroad pension and sheer grit. "I saw you at the auction," he said hoarsely. "You picked up a real riddle." "That I did," Nell answered. "No point in small talk, you mean to break it open." "That's right." He studied her for a while, his light blue eyes scanning her scant equipment. He noticed the tiny hammer she was polishing near the fire and the resolve in the way she held herself. "That little thing won't be enough," he commented, nodding at her father's hammer. "What you need is a proper sledge and a sharp chisel." He caught the brief look of dismay on her face. She couldn't afford those items and had nobody to ask for them. He bit his lip, then appeared to make up his mind. "I've got a sledge, some hardies and chisels that belonged to the crew foreman. He abandoned them after the line shut down." He paused before adding, "They're yours to use, as long as you split whatever's in that boxcar unless it's only spiders." It was a reasonable proposition, a collaboration driven by their shared need. "Deal," Nell said. The next day, Jedidiah came back carrying a 1-2-pound sledge, its handle worn smooth from years of use, along with a canvas pouch containing several sturdy steel chisels. They got to work. Nell recalled her father's teaching that brute force alone wouldn't do the job. Instead, she had to work the weld using the tongs and the improvised forge. She brought a chisel to a glowing red heat, then carefully shaped its edge with her father's hammer, setting up a precise angle to penetrate the old seam. This was a skill her father had passed on the delicate union of heat and pressure. Jedidiah observed with growing admiration, his doubt giving way to respect. "You've used a hammer before," he noted. "My father was a blacksmith," she answered, keeping her eyes on the task. For 3 straight days they toiled. Despite the protest of his aged limbs, Jedidiah swung the heavy sledge, hitting the chisel that Nell gripped firmly against the weld. The noise was an ear-splitting, steady ringing that carried across the barren landscape. Clang, a fragment of rust scattered. Clang, a tiny notch formed. Clang, the effort was grueling and draining. Every night they'd halt, stiff and sore, and Nell would restore the chisel's dull edge at the forge. On day 4, one last echoing strike from the sledge split the weld apart, revealing a dark seam. Using a pry bar they'd located, they forced it into the gap and pulled hard. The metal let out a groaning shriek. Finally, with a tremor that shook the entire car, the door came loose. The door rolled open with a piercing screech from the tortured steel, unveiling a pitch-black opening. A stale gust, trapped and lifeless for 30 years, swept past them, carrying odors of decay, grit, and another hint, a subtle iron flavor. They allowed the trapped air to clear for quite some time before Jedidiah finally lit a lantern. Raising it overhead, they looked in. The glow sliced through the darkness, revealing a tableau that had not changed in decades. The boxcar wasn't empty. It contained rows of wooden crates, stacked neatly and secured with metal bands. Yet their eyes were instantly pulled to the middle of the car. Fastened to the floorboards sat a big iron safe, roughly 3 feet across, with a thin coat of dust atop it. Lying nearby on its side lay a human skeleton, still wrapped in the torn remnants of a paymaster's railroad attire. A bony hand still touched the safe, as though shielding it one last time. "God have mercy," Jedidiah murmured, removing his hat. For a moment they remained silent, honoring the unidentified man trapped in this sepulcher. Nell's eyes scanned systematically, taking in the burly lock on the safe, and then spotting something more. A small ledger, bound in leather, lay close to the corpse's other hand, barely visible in the gloom. Moving cautiously into the car, her boots kicked up swirls of dust that shimmered in the lamplight. She lifted the volume. The binding was rigid, the hide parched and split. Flipping it open revealed a paymaster's register on the opening page, with entries penned in a tidy, exact script. The inscription said, "Wyoming and Pacific Line, payroll shipment, the 12th of August, 1855, Paymaster Elias Vance." That name didn't register with them, yet leafing through the pages showed columns of names, towns, and wages due. This was the pay for the hundreds of laborers who had constructed the very tracks beneath their feet. Tucking the ledger beneath her arm, she shifted her focus to the strongbox. Though the lock was imposing, Nell, schooled by a metalworker, viewed it as just another challenge rather than a deterrent. It employed a tumbler mechanism, and through the keyhole, she could make out the dim silhouette of the internal parts. Picking it would prove futile, yet an alternative existed. "The hinges," she told Jedidiah, "are mounted on the exterior." Those hinges were heavy iron bands, secured by substantial rivets, the same task as the door, albeit more delicate. They labored for another day, employing finer chisels and Nell's personal hammer. With pinpoint precision, she guided each chisel setting, snapping the rivet heads off sequentially. At last, the final head popped away, freeing the hinge strap, and they forced the massive lid open. Within velvet-cushioned recesses sat piles of gold pieces, double eagles that sparkled under the oil lamp, like fresh coinage. It was a small fortune, the complete payroll for the railroad's central division. Jedidiah gaped, breath hitching in his chest, yet Nell searched for something different. Within the ledger she'd taken lay a creased, sealed envelope bearing the identical, precise script. "To whoever finds this." She cracked the wax seal. Inside was a letter penned by Paymaster Elias Vance. He recounted that on the night of transport, masked individuals halted the train. His suspicion had been aroused, however. The heist was far too opportune, the setting too flawless. He identified the chief bandit's voice as belonging to an executive of the railroad itself. He understood that he was being framed to bear the blame for an orchestrated robbery. During his final hours, as the thieves eventually retreated, he sealed himself inside the baggage car and refused to unlock it. His choice was to leave the car stranded on a deserted track. Employing a mobile forge and welder taken from the shipment's tool chest, he welded the door shut from within. His closing statement was an appeal. "This orchestration was done by Silas Blackwood, the land acquisition vice president," he wrote. "His intention is to deploy these pilfered funds toward purchasing the very territory the railroad has rendered precious. Such a move would bankrupt the enterprise and defraud its builders. Evidence of his plot lies in this ledger, where gaps between the official records and the money I was carrying reveal the fraud. Please don't allow this robbery to go unpunished. Make certain the workers receive what they're owed, and justice prevails. My life is lost, but the truth must endure." Nell clutched the letter, her fingers shaking. Silas Blackwood was her own kin, her uncle. The bedrock of his wealth, his community, his every achievement rested on this crime from 3 decades past, entombed alongside a dead man's honor. This disclosure hung over the tiny, dusty parlor of the boarding house, not as an outburst, but as a thick, deep quiet. Seated at a crude wooden table were Nell, Jedidiah, and Martha, the robust, practical widow, who operated the town's unofficial gathering spot from her spotless little kitchen. The open ledger, and Elias Vance's last letter, were bathed in a cozy golden glow from the lantern. The gold stayed untouched in the boxcar, taking a back seat to the staggering revelation within the paymaster's careful handwriting. Martha had brought along a pot of dark coffee and a loaf of freshly baked bread. After Jedidiah shared the news, she perused the note once more, mouthing the words without sound. Though just a child when Caldera Spur had collapsed, the stories remained vivid in her memory. She recalled the railway abandoning them, pledges of wealth dissolving into nothing, and the families departing empty-handed with all they owned. "Silas Blackwood," she uttered, her tone carrying a suppressed, boiling fury. "That name I remember. Prior to the downfall, he had visited here. Dressed in an elegant suit, he pledged the world to everybody, claiming the spur would transform this valley into another Denver." Jedidiah nodded, his knotted fingers moving across the ledger's list. "These men I knew, fine individuals, among them foremen, engineers, and gandy dancers. According to what they were told, the payroll had been stolen, and the firm was bankrupt. In the end, they were sent off with meager compensation for months of grueling work." Turning to Nell, he said, "Your uncle took more than cash. He robbed this town of its future." The realization bore down on them heavily. In their hands lay proof that could topple one of the region's most influential figures. Yet, gazing at her newfound, unconventional companions, Nell understood that going public wouldn't work. Silas Blackwood commanded 3 decades of deep-rooted authority, legal connections, and sway. A young woman bearing a ledger unearthed from a rusty boxcar would be ignored, doubted, and crushed. The truth, she realized, required an entirely different instrument. Her father's advice echoed in her mind. "You've been taught to move with the grain, not against it." Here, the grain meant healing, not conflict. "We won't take this to the courts," Nell stated quietly yet resolutely, "or to the press. Instead, we'll honor Elias Vance's request. We'll make sure those men receive what they're owed." Martha and Jedidiah exchanged puzzled glances. "Child, most of those workers are long dead or scattered," Jedidiah said softly. 30 years have passed, but their kin are still here," Nell replied, tapping the book. Vance hadn't merely listed names. He'd also noted their places of origin: Anson, Kansas, Kearney, Nebraska. "Look here," she said, indicating an entry. "A foreman named Michael O'Connell made his home right in Caldera Spur." Martha gasped. "That's the O'Connell property." "It's vacant these days, yet his granddaughter Elspeth remains in the valley, a seamstress and widow with 2 young sons." An idea took shape, one driven not by revenge but by exacting, irrefutable fairness. What needed restoration wasn't a home but an obligation. The gold would serve not as personal wealth, but as an instrument of making amends. Their path was clear: trace every route recorded in the ledger. They would search out the heirs of those Blackwood had swindled, settling the unpaid wages in full. Every single payment would stand as a silent proof of what truly happened. The first sign of Blackwood's downfall took root not in a courtroom, but in the very towns he had drained dry. Progress would be gradual, meticulous, and formidable justice forged like metal on an anvil, with patience, accuracy, and lasting change. The following morning, they began the slow work of settling a 3-decade-old obligation. Money alone wasn't enough. The mission demanded genuine attention and heart. Nell approached the task with grace and reverence for history. She brought Jedidiah along to lend credibility, and Martha for her intimate familiarity with the valley's households. Their first stop was a modest, wind-beaten cabin at the valley's edge, where Elspeth O'Connell resided. They arrived in a borrowed wagon. Elspeth was in her mid-40s, her eyes weary and her hands roughened by labor, yet she welcomed them with tired courtesy. Instead of opening with Silas Blackwood or the missing gold, Nell spoke first of the woman's grandfather. "Mrs. O'Connell," Nell began softly, "we represent the Wyoming and Pacific Railroad. We're here to pay off what your grandfather, Michael O'Connell, was owed for acting as foreman during the summer of 1855. She showed the ledger, open to the page where Michael O'Connell's name stood out plainly, followed by his earnings. $180. Elspeth knitted her brow and stared at the page, clearly baffled. "My grandmother always said the railway failed and the payroll got stolen," Elspeth recalled. "That's what people were told," Nell responded cautiously. "In truth, the money wasn't taken, it was simply lost. And now it's been found." Nell set a small but weighty canvas sack on the table. It held the exact $180 in gold coins, tallied down to the last dollar in accordance with the ledger. In addition, there was a sum, representing 3 decades worth of interest, a number Nell had labored over for much of the night. "This is what was due to him," Nell explained as Elspeth untied the bag. Her hands shook at the sight of the shiny coins, more money than she had ever laid eyes on. That sum could buy fresh boots for her boys, patch the leaking roof, and buy seed for planting in the spring. Tears came to her eyes, not only because of the money, but because it finally validated a grievance her family had clung to for years. "He always insisted they were swindled," she murmured. "My grandmother passed away still holding that belief." Prior to departing, Nell requested Elspeth's signature on a straightforward receipt confirming she'd accepted the wages owed to Michael O'Connell. This document was essential to the strategy, one more written instrument to set against Blackwood's towering paper empire. Word of the payout spread across the valley, carried not by rumor alone, but through hushed, purposeful talk. 1 week on, Nell and Jedidiah settled the debt with a stonemason's grandson. The man had learned of the matter through Elspeth's cousin, and he received the funds with grave appreciation, signing the receipt at once. More were located. Among them, the daughter of a brakeman who operated a tiny bakery in an adjacent town. Additionally, they came across a land surveyor's nephew who had become the area's blacksmith. As every installment was paid, the tale expanded, converting from mere rumor into recorded reality. The once sleepy community of Caldera Spur started to awaken. The flow of money was like a spring downpour onto dried-out soil. The blacksmith ordered a fresh supply of iron, while Elspeth O'Connell paid a worker to restore her roof. Meanwhile, the general store in the neighboring town resumed its regular deliveries to Caldera Spur. Residents soon discussed plans for reconstruction and for breathing new life into the schoolhouse. Nell Ashby was no longer regarded as the odd girl who had purchased a corroded railcar. She was now viewed as the unassuming woman determined to put things right. She never mentioned her uncle's name, and there was no need to. The account book, the gold, and the ever-expanding bundle of signed documents communicated her story, constructing a truth far stronger than any accusation. Nell's days found a fresh cadence, shaped by the ledger and by the demands of the growing community. She left the decaying boarding house and moved into the railcar itself, aided by Jedidiah and the town's new smith. This smith was a young fellow by the name of Ben, and Nell had already paid the back wages due to his grandfather. Together, they turned that metal shell into a living space and an office. They installed windows in the sturdy sides and laid a true wooden floor above the iron base. A small, economical stove was built to hold off the Wyoming winds, and the once-abandoned boxcar, a former tomb and emblem of neglect, became the practical and emotional center of the newly revived Caldera Spur. Her makeshift desk was merely a pine plank resting on a couple of barrels, but it supported the symbols of her new standing: the paymaster's ledger, a cleanly arranged pile of signed receipts, and her own register for recording each and every dollar she disbursed. Her father's small cross-peen hammer rested on a sheaf of papers, its worn handle a steady link to the past. She was no wealthy benefactor handing out charity. She was a trustee, someone who proved her worth with every day of labor. With the ledger work completed, she pitched in alongside Martha to plant a community garden. Her hands were buried in the same dark soil that her payments were helping to restore and nourish. At the forge, she lent her hands to Ben, finding familiar satisfaction as her former skills came back, and she sharpened plowshares alongside mending wagon wheels. The townsfolk no longer considered her an outsider. They just called her Nell. In that quietly regenerating town, her name was uttered with unassuming reverence. Small routines developed. Jedidiah brought her coffee each morning, and Martha sent over one of Elspeth's boys each evening with a full plate. These small, mutual acts of consideration were knitting the town together, forming the real currency of any community. Eventually, the story of Caldera Spur's revival and its mysterious patron traveled the 100 miles east to Blackwood Station, arriving not as an official account but as whispers exchanged among freight drivers and wandering merchants. They told of a woman who was settling railroad debts from 3 decades ago in gold, and they mentioned a ledger. Silas Blackwood listened to the murmurings and understood at once. He recognized precisely where the ledger and the gold had originated, but he found himself cornered. If he disputed the payments, he would be calling respected men like Elias Vance liars. Lashing out at Nell would only expose the very crime he had gone to such lengths to bury. He was not being felled by some head-on strike, but by the slow, relentless pressure that his own past was applying. What brought it all to light was the one asset he had so carelessly thrown away: his power. A structure built upon stolen money and paper began to fracture. Lenders turned cautious, allies drifted away, and the entire paper empire crumbled beneath the weight of an unshakable truth. Nell never saw her uncle again. Months later, she learned that he had sold his bank and his holdings for just a fraction of their apparent worth. He moved away, vanishing from the territory he had once dreamed of dominating. He wasn't conquered in any dramatic showdown. He was simply made irrelevant through quiet, relentless honesty. Standing in the open doorway of her boxcar home, Nell felt the warmth of a coffee mug between her hands. The morning sun projected long shadows across the valley, and the air felt fresh and pure. From where she stood, she could see modest, yet evident signs of life. A newly installed roof atop the old livery, its lumber still pale and carrying the scent of pine. A thin line of smoke floated up from the blacksmith's chimney, accompanied by the soft, rhythmic ringing of a hammer hitting steel. 2 children, Elspeth O'Connell's sons, were chasing a dog through the sagebrush. This was the world created from $4 and a dead man's pledge. Nell herself had not become wealthy. Once the final debt had been settled with a far-off relative in Oregon, located through an exchange of correspondence, the gold had all but vanished. What was left wasn't a fortune. It was a town, a community, a home. She stepped back indoors and glanced at her desk, where the open paymaster's ledger revealed pages covered in Elias Vance's refined handwriting. He was someone she'd never encountered personally, yet his steady bravery had come to serve as the template for her own existence. Her father's hammer rested beside the ledger. She lifted it, feeling the hickory grip settle into her palm with a familiar ease. That hammer was meant for constructing, for molding, for producing pieces that were solid and honest. Her dad had instructed her about the behavior of steel, how to follow its grain to shape objects of utility and endurance. Elias Vance had similarly transformed his ledger, organizing names and figures into an instrument of indisputable fact. And in her own manner, she had carried on their labor. Rather than enriching herself, she had employed the ledger and the gold to build a community and repair a 3-decade-old rift. In her mind came Silas Blackwood, someone who viewed life solely through rows of gains and losses. He had written her off as a worthless resource. He had attempted to crush her, but just as properly tempered metal does, she flexed and then regained her form. Though he had banished her empty-handed, that very act ended up granting her all the world: the boxcar, the community, and a sense of purpose. She was Nell Ashby, 21 years old, cast away with just $10 to her name. 4 of those dollars went toward a sealed iron chest nobody wanted, left on an abandoned rail line in the middle of nowhere. That was the best money she'd ever laid out. We appreciate you tuning in for this tale of gentle perseverance and surprising fairness. Our world abounds in items that have been ignored, deserted, or branded as meaningless. Nell's journey, we trust, reinforces that truth. Often the highest worth lies just below the exterior, waiting for careful hands and watchful eyes. Should you have liked our narrative, feel free to pass it along to anyone who values the understated power of people who construct and repair. For today's question, tell us about a moment where you discovered surprising worth in an object or a person that had been given up on by others. Drop a comment down below. We go through each one. Until next time, remain near.